Ladies and gentlemen, as you just heard, we are here under very tragic circumstances. We are here because Nicole Vanderheiden was murdered. As you already know, Nicole was a mother of 3 young children. She loved her family. She loved life. And I agree, she died way too soon. As we progress through this trial, we're going to encounter difficult evidence that never have we wanted to encounter in our lives. It's going to be difficult, and we thank you. George thanks you for taking on the significant burden and seeing this case through to the right result. The evidence is going to show that the right result is a verdict of not guilty. Yes, the evidence will show that George's DNA, significant amounts of George's DNA, were on various pieces of evidence in this case, including on Nicole's body. The evidence is going to show that George's cell phone went to these various locations. He was with Nicole. The evidence is going to show you there was sexual contact. But at the end of the trial, you will have a completely innocent explanation that ties all of this evidence together. And in tying all of that evidence together, you will realize that George did not murder Nicole. Now remember, the evidence in this case is not what's been presented in the media. It's not what you've heard from friends. It's what you're going to hear in this courtroom. The evidence is going to come in piece by piece, day by day. I ask that you carefully consider each piece of that evidence as it comes in, and consider it as a piece of a puzzle. But don't try to solve the entire puzzle until you have all of the pieces. At the end of this trial, we will give you all of the pieces. You will be able to solve the puzzle. You will know the whole story, and you will know that this was not some random act as the state just described. You will know that Douglas Dietrich, Nicole's boyfriend, murdered Nicole. Ladies and gentlemen, this is George Burch. George Burch is a human being just like me and you. He's a United States citizen, and he's protected by the United States Constitution, the Wisconsin Constitution, and other laws that are designed to restrain the government's authority. This table, there are humans here, but this table is occupied by the government of the state of Wisconsin. They don't represent any particular individual. They represent the government interests as they see fit in this matter. As you've already heard, George is presumed innocent. As he sits here right now, he is considered innocent of this crime. He will remain innocent unless they can convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that he murdered Nicole. The judge already gave you the instruction on the state's burden of proof, presumption of innocence, and what is reasonable doubt. As you receive each piece of this puzzle, analyze it in light of that instruction. And remember, if you can reconcile the evidence upon any reasonable hypothesis consistent with George's innocence, you should do so and return a verdict of not guilty. Ladies and gentlemen, by the end of this trial, you're going to have a more than reasonable explanation. And that reasonable explanation is going to show that George did not commit this crime. Douglas Dietrich committed this crime. Now, some of you might have some preconceived notions of those of us in the courtroom. We've all heard stories of biased judges, corrupt prosecutors and law enforcement, and sleazy defense attorneys that are just looking for loopholes in the law. That's not the situation here. I can say that confidently. And the reason I can do that is because, for the most part, we agree with all of the state's evidence. And over the course of this trial, we're going to show you that that evidence that they just presented, once you have all the pieces to the puzzle, is consistent with George's innocence. What this case comes down to is the difference between how the state is interpreting this evidence, how the state is arguing this evidence, and what the evidence will actually show you once you have the full picture. I'm not going to complicate the case. We're not going to try to create doubt in your minds. What we're going to do, unlike the state just did in their opening, is give you all of the evidence. Give you the whole picture. And once you have that picture, you will know what the truth is. The state just described the initial investigation into this case. What the state didn't tell you, and as you will hear, is all signs of the initial investigation pointed to Douglas Dietrich as being the murderer. What the state didn't just tell you, and as you will hear, the state relied upon that evidence and arrested Douglas Dietrich. They took him to jail, and he sat there for 18 days. While he was in jail is when the state got that preliminary DNA testing result that they just described. And in light of that preliminary DNA testing with the unknown male contributor, the state chose to release Doug from custody. It wasn't because there wasn't any evidence that Dietrich committed this, because as you will hear, there was plenty. That's why he was arrested. But upon receiving these preliminary results, the state chose to release Doug. By the end of this trial, you will know why that was the wrong decision. As you just heard, after Doug's release, well, you didn't hear it was after Doug's release because you weren't informed that he was arrested. But at some point after Doug's release is when the second DNA results came back that the state just described to you. The DNA results that did indicate George's presence on the sock. What they told you from that point is true. They did further analysis and they were able to identify George's DNA, and they were able to see that the DNA, the unknown male DNA, was that of George. We don't disagree. We agree. That should be there. Now let's discuss exactly what the evidence is going to show. Keep in mind, when I say evidence, I'm not really talking about evidence that we collected. I'm not talking about stuff that we came up with so that we could confuse you or plant reasonable doubt in your mind. When I say evidence, for the most part, what I'm talking about is the evidence that the state collected and gathered into their investigation when they were looking to Doug Dietrich as being the murderer. It's going to be the evidence that they collected, that law enforcement collected, when all of those signs were pointing to Dietrich as being the murderer. This wasn't a random act. The evidence will show you that Doug had the motive to murder Nicole. The state couldn't offer you one reason why George would have any desire to kill Nicole. Doug did have that motive. Not only did he have that motive, but the evidence is going to show you that he had the opportunity to murder Nicole. He had direct involvement in her murder. You are going to learn, as this case goes on, through testimony of witnesses, that Doug and Nicole had a toxic relationship engulfed by arguments. The evidence is going to show that on the night of her murder, Doug left Nicole with people she barely even knew so that he could speak to other girls and snort amphetamines with a friend. You're going to learn that on the night of Nicole's murder, she texted Doug, "You're an abusive asshole. Why do you always hurt me?" As this trial goes on, and the state started to explain to you the tragic timeline of events that culminated in Doug's murderous act, you will hear that Friday, May 20th, was supposed to be a fun night out for Nicole. It was a well-deserved break from her normal duties of caring for her young family. Nicole arranged for one of her good friends, Dallas Kennedy, who you're going to hear from, to babysit her young son, Dylan, so that she could go out. The plan was for Nicole to go to a Steel Panther conference at the watering hole with some of Dietrich's friends. You're going to hear at first that everything went smoothly, just like the state just told you. When they were at the watering hole, in the beginning, they were having fun. They were drinking, laughing, dancing, and having a good time. Despite the fact that Nicole had just met some of Dietrich's friends, she was still able to have a good time with them. What the state didn't tell you is that changed. You're going to hear that Doug turned his attention from Nicole to other things more important to him. By the time the concert ended, Doug and his friend Greg were nowhere to be found. You will learn that Nicole, along with Doug's friends, decided that the night would continue at the sardine can. Instead of remaining at the watering hole alone, Nicole chose to go with Doug's friends to the sardine can. Again, no one spoke to Doug at this time. No one knew where Doug was. By the time the group arrived at the sardine can, even Doug's own friends were getting concerned as to why Doug was not with Nicole. You will hear that Doug's own friend, not Nicole's friend, but one of Doug's close friends, Angela, offered to call Doug after she saw Nicole was unsuccessful in her attempts to get a hold of him. Even though Doug had not answered all of Nicole's calls, he answered Angela's first call. Angela admonished Doug, asked him where the heck he was, and told him to get to the sardine can now because your girlfriend is alone. It wasn't until this point that Doug had any concern about Nicole. It wasn't until this point that Doug and his friend Greg attempted to catch up with the group at the sardine can. And the evidence is going to show you that the reason why they were still at the sardine can is because they were drinking, talking with other women, and snorting amphetamines. When they were finally on their way, or close to being on their way to the sardine can, Doug and Greg were able to finally connect with Nicole on a phone call. But it was too late. Nicole had had enough. They argued to no avail. Doug's friend Greg tried to intervene, but the call ended angrily. You will hear from the people that were with Nicole at the sardine can. You will learn how visibly, physically, and emotionally upset Nicole was at this point. She was so upset that she left the bar alone. Doug's friend did try to stop her, but nothing could stop her at this point. Enough was enough. She had to get away from this. Doug and Greg, the evidence will show, were on their way to the sardine can when they received the information that Nicole had left and was wandering alone. Greg, not Doug, drove his vehicle around for about 30 to 45 minutes trying to find Nicole. They couldn't find her, but they didn't call the police. They didn't keep searching. They went back to the sardine can, or they went to the sardine can for the first time. You will learn that Greg asked several individuals there if they had seen Nicole. You will hear testimony that at this point, when Doug got to the sardine can, he was pissed off and angry at Nicole. It wasn't long, though, before he returned to his priorities. He ordered shots he couldn't pay for, went by a fake name, hit on other women, and once again, snorted amphetamines. Eventually, Greg drove Doug home. On the way home, Greg again was looking to see if he could find Nicole. Still couldn't find her, so Greg continued on to that 2329 Berkeley Road address. Greg and Doug went inside that residence, spoke with the babysitter, Dallas, and Greg shortly left shortly thereafter. Doug, now that Greg's out of the picture, doesn't do anything to try to find Nicole. Rather, he just smokes weed. As you heard, the following day, Nicole's body was found in the middle of a field off 1374 Hoffman Road. You saw the picture. That's just 3 miles, approximately 3 miles from Doug's house, in the area he lived in the area that you will hear his family helped build, being in the construction business. The murder scene was at Doug's home on Berkeley Road. Doug didn't do anything the next day either. You'll hear that in the beginning, Doug didn't do anything. It wasn't until after Nicole's body was found, until after there was a large police presence by Hoffman, that he decided to call in a missing person report. This is not a random act that no one can comprehend. They had it right the first time. Doug murdered Nicole in a fit of jealousy and anger fueled by insecurity, alcohol, and numerous other drugs. Now, while the evidence is going to show you, once you have the whole picture, is that Doug murdered Nicole, again, that's not what we're here for. We're here for George Burch. George, who is presumed innocent. This is about whether the state can convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that George did this. The evidence is going to show you Doug did this. At the very least, it's going to give you significant doubt about whether or not George did this. This is going to be a long trial, but hang with us. By the end of the trial, we will get you all of the pieces that you need to solve this puzzle. That's why, in the end, during our closing argument, we're going to come back before you and ask you to return a not guilty verdict. We are going to ask you to not convict George Burch for a crime that he did not commit. Thank you.